I say common, you say ground. Common.
Ground.
Common.
Ground.
It is so great to see all of you here, new people who have been to a lot of our events over the last 3 years. New people who have not been to our events a lot. You can tell I'm nervous. And former folks who have been returning supporting for the last 3 years. My name is Ronald Towns, and I am one of the proud co-founders of Camp Common Ground.
My name is Zach Bell. I'm the other very proud co-founder and co-director with Ron.
Thank you. And tonight is actually our first time doing this type of event, a community roundtable, where we actually surface the issue of why we were founded in the first place. And I know that all of us, come from different sectors. Some of us are educators, some of us are in the foundation world, some of us are in housing, youth development, policy, or none of those. But we all are gathering here because we care about this really important issue that has been surfaced in the media over the last few years. But this is the first time, to our knowledge, that it has really been where a group of people have intentionally come together to actually not only talk about it, learn about the challenges, but also try to develop some action steps that we can do as a community to move the work forward. Tonight we're gonna start with a little bit about why we're here, a little bit about our experience. Then we're gonna share a little bit about the research of what is going on in the Bay Area right now to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're gonna hear from an incredible group of panelists who are in the work and are gonna help us understand what are the challenges and give us some guidance on what are some of the potential solutions to this issue of school and community segregation. So 5 years ago, I moved here from Chicago, and I've only been to Oakland for, 5 years ago. And I actually moved to work here at Envision Academy. So I taught 9th grade Algebra 1 and Math and Enrichment with Mr. Patnod, Dustin. 5 years ago, moved all the way from Chicago. When I moved here, one of the first students who I met was Kevin Sanchez. And Kevin is now, he is a senior at Envision, and I'm very proud of him, but Kevin was a trip. Kevin, not only did I have him in Algebra 1 class, Math Intervention class, but I also have him in my advisor. So I saw Kevin 3 hours a day, which for a high school teacher is a lot of time. And one day, Kevin came into advisory, and I was just like, in advisory, if you've ever been to school, advisory is like where you check in with kids, that social emotional stuff. And I was like, Kevin, how was your weekend? And he was like, Towns, it was not that great. And I was like, well, what's not great about it? He was like, Towns, well, I thought about the event that we're all preparing for. So let me give some background. Our advisory was a program called Build. And so we were going to an event where we were competing against kids from around the Bay Area, most of whom are not at urban schools. And so at this particular event, most of the kids were gonna be at private schools, and mostly gonna be white and Asian students. And this school, Envision, serves all Black and Latino students, mostly from low-income backgrounds. So Kevin was telling me after weeks of preparing, we have been doing this for weeks, months, and he was like, Towns, I'm not going. I was like, Kevin, and if you know me as a teacher, that strikes a bell. I'm like, what do you mean you're not going, Kevin? Of course you are. And he told me something that I will always remember, both as an educator, but also just as a human, is I'm not going because I know what they're gonna think about me. I know they don't expect me to do well, so I'm not gonna set myself up for failure. And what Kevin was saying, Kevin is Mexican American, and what he was saying was his perception was that the white other students and community that was gonna be there in particular, they already viewed him as not as competent, not as capable, and so he wasn't gonna put himself through that. And my only response, I was a little bit shocked, because as a teacher, you're like, oh, when a kid says that, you kind of want to wrap your arms around them, but you're not really sure what to say, so you just come up with something to say in the moment that sounds good. And what I said in that moment was, Kevin, that's not true. Let me tell you, I have a lot of white friends, and they don't think that way. And I said, Kevin, I have developed great relationships with people who are white, and I know that they think of me equally as they would you. Something like that, to kind of move him forward. He eventually ended up going to the event, etc. That was not a satisfactory answer, and here's why for me it wasn't. As a Black man, and as someone who grew up on the west side of Detroit, I'm not from Oakland, as I said, what Kevin was saying resonated with me, because that was the same thing that my mother and my aunt and the woman who raised me had told me in my household 20 years earlier. And they had told me that, you know, you have to be better just to be considered average because they are going to not view you as the same. You're gonna have to prove yourself. Do not bring a white person home to date. Do not, like, those were words that came in my house and of the households of my black friends and a lot of the students who I serve. For me, as one of the directors of Camp Common Ground, I know that there are many kids who look like me who are having those same conversations in their household, and those are their experiences that are real. And what we've tried to think about is, how do we bring kids together intentionally, given that our schools are so segregated, so they're not meeting people from different backgrounds in their schools or communities? How do we have them build meaningful relations across cultural lines so that they can move past the stereotypes that they're receiving in their homes and communities?
One of the things that I really love and feel was so powerful and special about this work is that it matters who you are and your identity. You bring that into this work. And Ron and I have different perspectives on why we came into this, and we talk about it all the time. For me, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, Jewish family, upper middle class. And even though I didn't receive necessarily like negative messages explicitly about other groups, I definitely had very clear messages of who is in my community and who is not. I was sent to Jewish summer camp for 10 years, which I loved, but was a very intentional effort. My dad told me he was sending me there so I would meet a Jewish girl to marry. I was like 8. And in high school, they wouldn't let me date someone who wasn't Jewish. I fortunately grew up in a city and felt, you know, more comfortable than some other folks might. But when I got to UPenn in Philadelphia, which is there, it felt like the racial tensions and the discomfort was at a different level. And Penn has a historically bad relationship with West Philadelphia, predominantly an historically black community. A lot of folks have been displaced as it expanded further west. And actually even the neighborhood used to be called Black Bottom, was then renamed University City. So there was a displacement and erasure, right? And what was so difficult too was that the messaging was very clear from Penn. We actually had to, during orientation, watch a video about a Penn student from like 10 years before who had been shot when she was in West Philadelphia, not fatally, but it was this very clear message of don't go past 40th Street, they are dangerous, they are different, they're not part of our community. And so I felt like for those 4 years I walked and watched interactions like, it sort of felt like I saw this on repeat, some, you know, like an affluent white kid on his way to a frat party stepping around or over a homeless black person. Obviously that exact scenario didn't happen every time, but that's what it felt like being there. And I didn't know what to do. I was probably self-righteous and was like, this is wrong, because I just knew something wasn't right there. Because to me, for that to make sense, it has to be in a world where you don't view that person as fully human, or at the very least, not in your community. And then when I started working in schools, I was at University City High School my junior year summer, which has now been shut down. And I became close with this high school student, Martez. He was only a few years younger than me because I was in college. And he was really likable and social and athletic, but was pretty quiet around academics. And we were doing a final project, and it was the first time I'd seen him write. And he wouldn't start writing. And he finally started putting out like a sentence, and it was honestly very hard to understand and hard to read. And in that moment, my mind went, this black boy is lazy. Or he's just dumb. And realizing myself that this is a boy I even really liked, and I'm a well-intentioned white person. These are not things that are easy to deconstruct. And so I thought in my head, like, how can we have a situation where we actually construct those differently, and where that, whether it's that person on the street or Martez or whatever, where it's not an other, but someone who really feels like part of our community. And one last thing I'll say is that something that also happened as I got older was there was someone from my Jewish community who really did struggle, who got kicked out of multiple schools, had substance abuse issues, was in trouble with the law, and people in our community gave him second, third, fourth, fifth chances because he was one of us. And we weren't going to abandon them. And I just wondered what would be required for people to feel that way about people who don't look like them, aren't technically in their community. And so that's, I feel like, where Camp Common Ground came from for me. And I feel so honored to be able to do it with Ron.
Same here. Well, we're gonna. We talk about our experiences, and when we founded Camp Conrad, we were like, okay, are these just Zach and Ron's experiences, or are these like real issues, right? Like other people's experiences. So then we did our homework, and so we pulled together just some brief slides just to make sure we all understand the lay of the land. Right now in OUSD, so for those of you who are not at OUSD, that's Oakland Unified School District, and that is the public school system in Oakland. Oakland Achieves, which is a coalition of educators, came together in 2014, and they started studying patterns of segregation in Oakland. What they looked at was which students are staying in OUSD from kindergarten through 12th grade, which ones are not, and when are they leaving, like what are the patterns? What they found was that, and sorry the y-axis here is kind of blurry, but basically that Asian and white families are keeping their kids in OUSD up until 5th grade. Up until 5th grade. So really in 6th grade, which is when middle school begins, half of Asian and white students who were previously in OUSD are no longer there. By contrast, Black and Latino students, or the families of Black and Latino students are keeping their Black and Latino students in school, in OUSD schools. The percentage is about 80%, 70 to 80% a given year. So those students in middle school are experiencing racial segregation for the first time in their school. So middle school is really the time in Oakland where we're seeing this divide in our schools, and you can literally, and we'll look at a map later, Zach's gonna move us through that. You can see a map that shows by racial category where folks are. And that is why at Camp Conrad we actually focus intentionally on middle schoolers, and we'll talk about what we do with them. We also thought about, okay, so we have the racial factor. What about class? Are there any intersections between race and class? And there are. KQED in 2016 had our former superintendent of OUSD on the radio show to speak about this, and that superintendent reported that 72% of Black students and 80% of Latino students in OUSD have classmates from low-income backgrounds, versus 37% of their white counterparts have low-income, have peers from low-income backgrounds. So also, when we get to middle school, we're seeing this class divide where we have kids from Black and Latino communities are also experiencing class segregation, and their white counterparts are not having the same level of class segregation as the Black and Latino students. So you may be asking, okay, if kids aren't going to school together, they're not living together, where are they getting their information about people who don't look like them, right, or from different backgrounds? Well, like Zach and I talked about, we got it from our families, right, they get it from the communities, but because where we are, they also get it from media, right, huge thing. Common Sense Media last year did a study on Bay Area, so this is not just Oakland, but Bay Area, middle and high school students, and they asked them, would you agree with certain statements? Half of the youth who were surveyed agreed with the following statement, that whenever I see a Black or Latino person in the news, they're usually involved in crimes, violence, or other problems. After asking this question or these set of statements, Common Sense Media researchers also asked, how does that influence your perception, or studied how does that influence their perception of kids from that racial group? And they found that there is a strong correlation between what kids saw in the media about Black and Latino youth and their beliefs, which are mostly negative, associated with crime, violence, other problems, et cetera, through a series of implicit bias tests that they did. So we see that our kids are getting information about kids who don't look like them or from different places than them from other sources that are not from actual people.
Anyone here a visual learner? Any visual learners in the audience? Oh, right, a lot. Has anyone ever seen a map that looks like this? A couple people? So on the left was University of Virginia. Folks did a dot map study using the 2010 census data. The color's a little hard to see here, but one dot is for one person, and they're colored according to race. So the blue dots are white folks, and you can see that's essentially the hills and in Piedmont. Then black is green, and that's sort of West Oakland and East Oakland. Asian is red, and that's sort of around the lake and in Chinatown, and Hispanic is mostly in deep East Oakland. This was a few years ago, we found this map. We were doing like our first promo video about this camp, and we were both kind of shocked. Like, we knew it was bad, but you could show this to an elementary school student, and they'd be like, oh yeah, the blue people live up there, and the red people and the orange and the green. It really is that stark. And we'll talk maybe a little bit later about how housing and all that relates to school segregation, but here's a really cool, you can see the map over here, which is of schools. So this was done by researchers at UC Berkeley and was reported out by SF Gate. And the darker, this is in Oakland Unified, the darker purple indicates a greater percentage of Black or Hispanic children. Again, extremely stark, right? East Oakland, a little bit into West Oakland, and then the hills are predominantly white.
And so just briefly, we want to talk about a little about what we do and how our work is actually not enough, and hence why we're here tonight. So we work on the youth development side, and we know that that is not enough, but we want to spend a little bit of time speaking quickly about what we do. We basically are like, we cannot change school attendance boundaries. We don't have the power to do that, but we can provide alternative spaces for kids to intentionally build relationships across cultural lines. So we basically spend the school year recruiting 30 to 40 kids from about 30 different communities. They represent different racial, economic groups, different communities in the Bay Area, and we bring them to our summer camp. And so it's called Camp Common Ground, but it's not just, we do like the canoeing, the archery, the hiking, so kids can build organically build meaningful relationships. But we actually have a curriculum where we intentionally teach a set of skills to get them not only to be, to change their perspective about others who don't look like them, but also to not only do that, but to lead change efforts around integration when they leave us. And could you go to the next slide, Zach? So basically we divide our curriculum into 3 buckets. One is called knowledge. So we teach our kids about identity. So the things Zach and I mentioned. And also, how does identity influence our perspective on the world? In middle school, if you've ever worked with a middle schooler, a lot of times this is their first time hearing about identity and what that means. We then are like, okay, so we understand that identity influences our perspective. Now, how do we develop empathy for people who are not from the same places as us, who don't look like us? So we've identified 2 skills that we feel like are middle school appropriate: active listening to build those relationships, and sharing vulnerably to build those relationships. So if you've ever worked with middle schoolers, you know both of those can be challenging, right? Getting them to do that. But we believe that those are 2 very important skills for them to build relationships across lines with people who don't look like them. And then the final part of the curriculum is the doing part. So we really feel that it's not enough for them to just come to our camp. And we don't have the capacity to serve hundreds of kids in Oakland, but we do have the capacity to train our kids to indirectly impact their peers. And so what they do is they go home after camp, right? And they write what's called a plan for disruption. And so what that is, it's a piece of paper. And it's a plan. It lists another kid's name in their school. They list the social norm that excludes that kid. So they'll say maybe it's around race in their school, around class. One girl, Indigo, in our program, she wrote about a boy who's Black. He's the only Black boy in her class, and how he is excluded, viewed by the teachers and students as really loud, obnoxious, etc. And then she lists what are her action steps based on what she learned at Camp Common Ground. We meet with Indigo and our cohort of 30 kids 3 times during the school year, where they share that plan, they give feedback to each other on that plan, and they present their plan to the next group of kids who come in the following year. So that's kind of our work, but we also understand that that is not enough. We are thinking about how at a systems level do we address this issue.